constitutional changes. There could be 2 changes coming to the Constitution in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But what are these changes? How are they going to impact you and me? And what role do we play in that process? Gordon Denlinger, former state representative and currently the state director for the NFIB in Pennsylvania, joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. There are 2 proposed changes to the Constitution here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but as often is the case with constitutional changes, we're not always quite sure how they impact us or what our role as voters are in that process. Former State Representative Gordon Denlinger, who currently serves as the State Director for the National Federation of Independent Business here in Pennsylvania, is going to join us as we break down these 2 constitutional questions and what it might mean for families and businesses across the state. Representative Denlinger, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Thank you, Sam. Great to join you.
It's good to have you back. Let's just jump right into this. There are 2 proposals here, and to be clear to our viewers, this is the state constitution of Pennsylvania we're talking about, not the U.S. Constitution. But in the state constitution, before we even jump into the content of this, these amendment proposals, once they pass the House and the Senate, actually require these Commonwealth voters to vote on them. Is that correct?
That is correct. And interestingly, the governor does not get a say on these. They pass simple majority votes, House and Senate sides, and then they go before we the people for a vote at the next available election, which for these 2, it will be the May primary coming up here. And so we all get to chew on the issue and consider how we want to vote personally, because it's the citizens who will decide.
I think that's so important because it's easy when you campaign for a person. We have feelings and emotions and ideas about people as candidates, but these are issues that are coming up on the ballot. And I think a lot of times we go vote and we're not even aware that there are issues to vote on. And so this becomes so imperative for us to take seriously. Gordon, I want to start with the Senate Bill 2, which is one of the proposed amendments, one of the proposed changes, and it deals with the governor's emergency powers. Now, this is done as a response and reaction to Governor Wolf's continual emergency declaration here in Pennsylvania as a result of the pandemic. What triggered this amendment to come to the floor and to pass?
Sam, it's probably a lack of collaboration on the part of the governor with the General Assembly. The current law stipulates that once you do an emergency declaration, he gets 90 days of emergency powers, and the only thing he needs to do to re-up for another 90 days is essentially put his signature on another piece of paper and renew it. He has done this sort of extended fashion with the opioid crisis in the state. So that has been a long-term extended emergency declaration. And the power to do this goes back to a time of great tragedy, and that was the Agnes hurricane floods that had occurred all over the state. And the decision was made at that time to give a governor, any future governor, broad powers to just help deal with those situations. The question that has arisen is through mandated, health edicts, business closures, what have you, has the governor overreached in this current pandemic? And for that reason, do we need to bring that pendulum back from the broad powers given back in the early 70s, 1972, I believe, and try to balance out the governor's power with more inputs from the General Assembly? The proposed amendment would limit the time frame from 90 days down to 21, at which point the governor would then have to go before the General Assembly and ask for a renewal for an extended period of time. And the sense, again, is the governor unilaterally has been mandating and that there needs to be more of the people's representatives having a voice in this process.
When the governor makes an emergency declaration, what powers does that come with? I mean, are there things that the governor now can do that would normally require legislative action?
Yes, it sets aside the need to legislate and gives actually fairly robust powers to mandate public health, particularly emergency mitigation in the case of, as I mentioned, the flood
Mm-hmm.
situation earlier, with regard to emergency management or first response and so forth. So it's a pretty broad range of powers, which enables any governor to set aside the legislative process and just issue edicts and mandates. And that's, again, the central point of concern.
The governor's argument in return is that this wouldn't actually impact anything that's being done currently within the COVID-19 pandemic, but that instead this would cost the state federal emergency dollars, that we have to be under an emergency declaration in order for us to receive federal dollars. How do you respond to that? And is that a
Well,
concern?
sure, and that's procedurally correct. The issue is if the emergency is significant enough, wouldn't there be bipartisan support for it? I would say yes, absolutely, that the governor, as opposed again to acting alone, just needs to come, make the case, and see, a majority. It doesn't have to be all Republicans signing on, but could he get, his own Democratic Party on board, and another 20 or 30 Republicans who share the concern, and go ahead and extend the period of declaration and avail the state of the federal funds. I think that's certainly achievable. I think people on both sides of the aisle have deep concerns about health impacts and the nature of this pandemic and any type of emergency that would come upon Pennsylvania. So I think it's probably a move toward collaboration and unitedness in response to emergencies, as opposed to one man at one desk makes all the decisions.
The interesting thing about this is that this is neither a partisan issue nor is it a strictly local or state issue. Not that long ago in the federal government, this issue was raised when President Trump used presidential powers to declare an emergency in order to secure funding for the border wall after the Congress had rejected lowered the requested amount of dollars for the border wall. And ironically, it was our Senator, Pat Toomey, fellow Republican, who stepped up to try to override that action by the president, to say that there need to be limits on emergency declaration powers and the executive taking more power than what would be rightfully theirs. So we see this occurring on both ends. My question here is, where do you see the balance being? Because on the one end, to your point with the hurricane, there is a sense in which the executive should have some form of ability in an emergency when we cannot wait to assemble the legislature to say we're going to act and we're going to act now because we have to. And then on the other end of essentially abusing that privilege and unilaterally extending an emergency declaration for however long they would like, for whatever purposes they would like. Where do we balance that? And is this amendment the answer to that?
Yeah, and it's a tough call, and one we probably never get exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
The granting of emergency power is, as we said earlier, subverting the normal legislative process, setting it aside. And so for that reason, the sort of protections that we, the people, have in our government kind of are also set to the side. And that's a bipartisan statement. Whether, future governors, Republican or Democrat, would all be limited in the way that this amendment is putting in place. Now, the question is, the immediate reaction ability of a governor would still absolutely be in place. Mm-hmm. The 21 days would get you through the first immediate situation like the flood and or whatever other emergency there would be. So there would still be emergency powers. I think the question is one of duration and one of collaboration. The need to, again, have it not be so long, have it not then revert back to sort of a, everybody working together, a more unified approach to disaster mitigation. So, following the flood of 72, the pendulum swung very far into giving future governors an amazing amount of power.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're living through this time. And, it does break down, we'll say, a little bit politically, but more broadly, regional perhaps, for people to say, that pendulum needs to come back, and somewhere in the middle is the right answer. We still need emergency powers declaration, absolutely. Nobody's questioning that. The question is how long and when does it become collaborative and the General Assembly gets involved in the process.
It's similar to what James Madison actually argues in Federalist 10, the idea that when we have divisions and disagreements, our human inclination is to just remove the cause, right? If we remove the person, for our opponent from the conversation, is an easy win, but we actually never address the issue. And the idea that we have to mitigate its impact, and if we can, force people to come to the table to collaborate, which is exactly the case that you're presenting. Representative Denlinger, thank you for those insights. When we come back, I want to start breaking down the second constitutional amendment that we could see, and this deals with, ironically, jurisdiction, jurisprudence, and our state Supreme Court. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Representative Gordon Denlinger is our guest, and we're breaking down potential changes coming to the Constitution here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That should be a tongue twister. Coming changes to the Commonwealth's Constitution. Oh my goodness. Representative, welcome back. We just talked about a potential change to the governor's emergency powers. We're now going to shift to a different branch of government, and one of the proposed constitutional changes deals with the state judiciary. A lot to unpack. We could do countless episodes on the structure of the state judiciary. It is one of the unique state judiciaries in that we have partisan election of judges. And the proposal right now, judges run statewide in Pennsylvania. The proposals that break them into 7 judicial districts. This would be for the state Supreme Court, the state Superior Court, and the state Commonwealth Court. Where did this proposal arise from? And I mean, what are your thoughts as far as where this goes?
Sure. It probably has its genesis in the judicial elections of 2015. And the concern that the Republican side in particular has over the fact that in that cycle, the Democratic judicial activists, if we will call them that, kind of swept the field and won 4 seats on the court, and in essence took over the state Supreme Court and changed sort of a centrist approach on our court into much more of a left activist position, which has been interesting to watch play out. It played out significantly during the 2020 election cycle when different law cases that were brought up in state courts were summarily dismissed. Those brought up, of course, by the outgoing Trump administration legal team. And those cases were all dismissed. As in contrast with Michigan, which has a balanced court, and actually the governor there did have to work with that court, very different in Michigan than Pennsylvania. So the question is, how did this idea gain ground? Well, when you look at the makeup of the backgrounds of those who sit on these various courts, there's a very heavy weighting toward Philadelphia County and Allegheny County, which would be Pittsburgh. So the idea is if we create the districts, we'll get a more broad spread representation on our courts and probably some more, shall we say, conservative values on our courts. That remains to be seen. But as far as the driving force behind it, it was to try to deal with the activist court that's currently in place, and then try to bring more balance to the court going forward to try to promote more business-friendly decisions, shall we say, and more conservative-friendly decisions.
I think there's, and the other side of this too, of course, in 2018, when they redistricted all the seats, the congressional seats, this is something that was not brought up in 2012, 2014, 2016, and then 2018, they redistricted everything. At that time, former Congressman Ryan Costello tweeted that the Supreme Court justices should be impeached for their role in actively drafting districts and inserting themselves in the process of redistricting. But along those lines, I mean, there's a concern that's raised here that if there's a recognized problem with the Supreme Court as it is now, but there's a concern that if we begin to draw them into districts, that this becomes subject to gerrymandering and we politicize the courts even more. And so individuals like myself, one of our criticisms of the current system is that we have partisan election of judges and that fundamentally we're over politicizing a judiciary. Wouldn't allowing these seats to be gerrymandered take that another step further?
Certainly a point for consideration. And, the sort of other side in terms of judicial reform is the push for merit selection of judges as opposed to having political election. And that would be another show or two for us to do, Sam. But merit selection is frankly supported pretty heavily by the business community. Not so much by NFIB's membership across the state, but that said, should we take this out of the vote of the people and allow governors essentially to nominate and the Senate to approve as they do at the federal level with the U.S. Supreme Court? So it would match that system. Whichever side is making the picks of judges is politicized at that level. So, but in theory, we elect Republicans and we elect Democrats to the governor's mansion. So would there be some swing back and forth in that equation? Arguably, yes. So, as a point of judicial reform, merit selection of judges as opposed to to electing partisan elections of our judges is often trotted out as a preferred alternative to judicial districts. It'd be interesting to see. I think depending on where folks come down, it's not a narrowly Republican versus Democrat issue. Some of it gets into again, that merit selection idea as a preferred alternative to this judicial district idea. It's going to be an interesting one for voters, and we the people get the vote. Coming up here in May. So. We get to wrestle through it and make a decision, but I expect there will be the against side, probably the trial bar and others there who would oppose, and then some on the business side they would come out in favor of it.
Sure.
So we'll see.
And to your point, and that's an argument that I've made in the past in favor of merit selection, and yet you could easily point to the Supreme Court and say, well, they haven't done a very good job depoliticizing that in Congress. And so your point is well taken. The other proposal I've seen in various other states is the idea of having judicial elections, but them not being partisan. That all candidates run in one election. There are no primaries, that the candidates would run out. The primary would serve as the first election, and then there would be a runoff of the top how many ever seats, but that Republicans and Democrats together would run without their party affiliation. Is that something that's ever been proposed in Pennsylvania? Is that something that you think would even fly in Pennsylvania?
Has it been proposed? I'm not aware that it has, and that, of course, would be a constitutional change. So it would rise to that level. But no, I'm not aware that that's been a serious part of the discussion. It's, I guess, call me cynical at this point in life, but is there any place on earth where you can drive politics completely out of the equation? I remain unconvinced that you can ever completely divorce yourself from politics in the redistricting process, in the judicial selections, and the rest of it. One challenge that candidates for judge face is that under the judicial canons, they're really not supposed to share their ideological viewpoints if it might, I guess you'd say, open up an understanding of how they might rule on cases. Because in so doing, they taint themselves with regard to cases that might come before them once they achieve the bench. So, it's been tough for voters to really, we go into the polls and we see the party designations, but they're really not allowed to talk about their views on specific, social policies or economic policies, what have you. Again, because then they would need to recuse themselves should a case of that nature come before them. So it's really a challenging system that we have, the voting for our judges, and it's tough for them to run, because they're kind of handcuffed in a way. They can't talk about, hey, I'm for this, I'm against that. You vote for me, here's what you're going to get. So we try to sort through that, trying to pick up small bits and cues, and about what a person might think or how they're wired. But admittedly, it's been a problem as a process for decades, going way back. And Pennsylvania, you mentioned impeachment. There are occasionally calls for the impeachment of judges. I think literally there is one in Pennsylvania's history that has been removed from office, and that was after the pay raise vote of 2005, the infamous pay raise. And that was just because that poor individual happened to be the next guy up on the ballot. And so the voters in anger went in. He had nothing to do with it. Actually, I think any rulings were in the other direction from him, but he was the guy and he was going to get it. And he lost the next election, which was a retention vote, yes or no, on retaining him.
Wow, it's certainly a challenge because the judiciary, to your point, Representative, is out on the outside of the political side. It's Senator Ben Sass in Nebraska always says it should be a litmus test that we are protesting outside the Supreme Court instead of outside of the Congress. And I think that applies, and yet it makes it that much harder when we talk about voting for judges when it's not supposed to be political. And yet, to your point, what in life isn't political anymore? And so certainly a challenge that we as voters in this state will have to make up our minds over the next few months. Representative Gordon Denlinger, again, thank you for your time, and don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Gordon, thank you again for your insights and your time. I want to close out by asking you about something that is going on in your old workplace, the State House of Representatives. Two representatives I believe you've worked with before, Representative Greg Rothman, a Republican, and Representative Steve Kinsey, a Democrat, in this current session have announced a bipartisan partnership. And it's not to say they agree on everything, but they're going to seek common ground, and they're inviting other members around them to join. What do you see as the driving motivation behind this? And in a very polarized world, do you think that Rothman and Kinsey could achieve any success in this?
I do, and I'm very happy that they're doing that. I think we need more of it. And a lot of it, I think, is just lowering the temperatures and having discussion and getting to know people as people. And I think too often in the assembly we have the aisle down the middle, and that's the Great Wall. And everybody just lobs mud balls across the aisle in the chamber, and that really is unfortunate because somewhere in the middle of all of it, I think some really good, important things can get done. So I applaud Representatives Rothman and Kinsey for their effort. I hope others join with. At the end of the day, if we're going to self-govern, we need to come to some level of agreement and move the ball forward. So kudos to them for that initiative.
Yeah, when you were in office, did you see polarization as bad as you see it today?
I think it's gotten worse, but I still see signs of hope. I personally partnered with folks who were very far to the left of me, but when we came to some issue that was like, yep, we're together here, then you jointly do legislation, and wow, it's more powerful when both sides are speaking to an issue. So I think there's huge opportunity for legislative wins, and I think the public takes some assurance in that at the end of the day, we're all Pennsylvanians, we're all Americans, and again, if we're going to self-govern, then we can't just yell at each other. We need to come to some handshakes along the way.
One of the things you said earlier was the idea with Rothman and Kinsey here that they are seeing each other as people first. What advice do you give? Because I don't think this is just a problem within our chambers. In fact, I think it's a larger problem outside of our chambers, that our society has become so politicized. And in so many ways, politics is a business, that they're giving the consumer what the consumer wants. What advice do you have for our viewers, for our neighbors, about how we see the humanity in people, and especially in those people that we have very stringent disagreements with?
I think it's as simple as engagement with community and civic organizations where we find a place of commonality. That can be in service clubs, in churches, in civic endeavors, wherever that you happen to find that. But kind of get out of our doors. And I know it's a tough time right now to be saying that with the pandemic, but places where we come together as community for good causes and learn to once again know each other and realize that we're shared on a shared journey here in our communities. And I think that is the road back for us as a people. If we're going to lower the temperature, it's going to get out of the doors, out of our home door, work together with people out in our community. I think that's how we build the spirit of goodwill all across Pennsylvania and the nation.
I think that's fantastic advice. Representative Gordon Denlinger, thank you again for your time and for your insights. That is our show for tonight. I want to thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next week. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.